Application programming interfaces are now the primary way software systems talk to each other, and that makes them the front door for many of the most sensitive actions an organization performs. When a service can create an account, move money, retrieve personal records, or trigger a deployment through an application programming interface call, the application programming interface becomes the control plane. That control plane is attractive because it concentrates power behind predictable endpoints that can be probed, automated, and abused at scale. This is why application programming interface security is not an optional enhancement layered on later, but a foundational design requirement for modern distributed systems. If you treat application programming interfaces as just plumbing, you end up granting attackers a clean, well-documented pathway into your most important business functions. Authentication in application programming interfaces is about verifying who or what is calling, and in practice, that often means tokens, keys, or certificates. Tokens are commonly used because they are flexible and can represent a user, a device, or a service identity without exposing a long-lived secret on every request. Keys are common in simpler integrations, but they require careful handling because a leaked key often behaves like a master password for a calling system. Certificates can provide strong assurance when used correctly because they tie identity to cryptographic material that is harder to guess or brute force than shared secrets. The important point is that authentication is not merely a header value or a string comparison, but a trust decision that must be resilient to theft, replay, and misuse under automation. Authorization is the next decision, and it is where many otherwise strong application programming interface designs fail. Authorization determines what an authenticated caller is allowed to do, which endpoints they can access, and which data they can act upon, and it must be enforced consistently on every sensitive call. Scopes and roles are common tools for expressing authorization intent, but the expression is not the same thing as enforcement, so the service must validate those claims server-side. A common failure mode is coarse permissions, where callers are granted broad access because it is easier operationally, and that turns any single credential compromise into full compromise. Another failure mode is inconsistent checks, where some endpoints enforce roles strictly, while others assume trust based on being internal, which collapses boundaries exactly where attackers like to operate. Input validation is where you protect both the parsers that interpret requests and the business logic that acts on their contents. Application programming interfaces are often built on structured formats, and those formats can carry unexpected values, oversized payloads, or encoded tricks that bypass naive checks. Validation needs to confirm type, size, format, and allowed values, and it should happen before the data reaches sensitive operations like database queries, templating, or command execution. Business logic validation is equally important because an input can be syntactically valid but semantically abusive, such as requesting an impossible state transition or manipulating identifiers outside an authorized scope. The deeper idea is that validation is boundary enforcement, and boundaries matter most at the moment untrusted data crosses into trusted computation. Rate limiting is a control that addresses the reality that application programming interfaces are easy to automate, and that automation amplifies abuse. Without limits, attackers can scrape data, brute force credentials, enumerate identifiers, and apply denial of service pressure with very little cost. Rate limiting works best when it is tied to identities, source characteristics, and risk signals, because blunt global limits can harm legitimate users while still allowing distributed attacks. It also needs to be designed with business workflows in mind, because some legitimate operations occur in bursts, and you want predictable behavior rather than random failures.
When implemented thoughtfully, rate limiting changes attacker economics by making repeated attempts expensive and noisy, which improves both prevention and detection.
Transport protection is non-negotiable because application programming interface traffic often carries credentials, session tokens, and sensitive data. Transport layer security provides confidentiality and integrity in transit, but the details matter because weak configuration undermines the promise even when encryption is present. Strong configuration includes modern protocol versions, appropriate cipher choices, and correct handling of certificate validation, so the client can detect imposters and resist interception. Certificate validation failures are especially dangerous in service integration because automated clients may be configured to accept anything to avoid operational issues, and that opens the door to man-in-the-middle attacks. The goal is to make the network a less useful place for attackers by ensuring that intercepted traffic is neither readable nor modifiable without detection. Secrets management is what keeps application programming interface keys and signing keys from becoming accidental shared liabilities across teams and environments. A secret that leaks through logs, source control, configuration files, or build artifacts often has a long half-life because it propagates into copies, backups, and caches before anyone notices. Good secrets management reduces that propagation by centralizing storage, controlling access through identity and authorization, and supporting rotation so compromised secrets can be replaced quickly. It also limits the contexts in which secrets appear, which reduces the chance they are exposed by debugging tools or error messages. The most important mindset is that secrets are not static configuration values, but sensitive assets with lifecycle requirements that must be engineered into the system.
Logging is the control that turns application programming interface security from aspiration into operational reality because it provides traceability and detection. At a minimum, you want records of requests, identities, authorization outcomes, and key decision points like privilege changes, failed authentication attempts, and unusual access patterns. Logs need enough context to support investigation, including correlation identifiers that link requests across services in a distributed workflow. At the same time, logging must avoid capturing secrets and sensitive payloads unnecessarily, because that turns the log store into a new data breach target. When logging is designed well, it supports both forensics and real-time monitoring, making it possible to spot abuse patterns that individual services might otherwise miss.
Error handling is an area where usability and security have to be balanced deliberately rather than accidentally. Clients need actionable feedback so they can correct mistakes, handle retries, and respond to validation failures. But attackers also benefit from overly detailed error messages that reveal internal state. Leaking stack traces, database errors, or internal identifiers can turn a blind probing effort into a guided attack. A secure approach uses consistent, structured error responses that communicate what went wrong at a high level while avoiding disclosure of sensitive implementation details. This does not mean being vague to the point of uselessness, but it does mean treating error messages as part of the attack surface, because they often reflect how the system thinks internally. Versioning is how you manage change in application programming interfaces without breaking clients or weakening controls over time. If clients depend on stable semantics, uncontrolled changes can force rushed compatibility hacks that introduce security gaps, such as bypassing authorization checks for legacy behavior. Versioning strategies should ensure that older versions do not linger indefinitely, because long-lived legacy interfaces accumulate risk as dependencies and assumptions change. Deprecation must be planned, communicated, and enforced, or else the organization becomes trapped supporting insecure endpoints for compatibility reasons. Versioning also interacts with validation and authorization because new fields and new actions must be introduced with clear security semantics rather than being bolted on to existing models. The goal is predictable evolution, where security controls remain consistent across versions instead of eroding with each compatibility patch. Service-to-service identity is where many modern breaches gain leverage, because internal integrations often carry high privilege and broad access. Mutual authentication is a common approach here, where both sides prove identity, reducing the chance that a rogue service or compromised workload can impersonate a trusted caller. The trust relationship should be narrow, meaning a service should authenticate only to the specific services it needs, rather than operating with a token that grants broad access across an entire environment. This is where least privilege becomes concrete, because narrow trust relationships reduce blast radius and make policy failures easier to contain. When service identity is designed carefully, you get stronger separation inside the architecture, rather than a flat internal network where inside is treated as trustworthy by default.
Gateway patterns are often used to centralize policy enforcement, monitoring, and request shaping, and they can be valuable when applied with clear intent. A gateway can enforce authentication, apply rate limits, validate certain request properties, and standardize logging, which reduces duplicated security code across many services. It can also provide a single point for observability, where you can detect abuse patterns across interfaces, rather than service by service. However, centralization creates a concentration of risk because a misconfigured or compromised gateway can impact many services at once. The security value comes from consistency and visibility, but it must be paired with strong configuration management and separation of duties, so the gateway does not become an easy place to weaken controls for convenience.
Dependency security matters because integrated services inherit each other's weaknesses, and a secure application programming interface boundary is not a magic shield against a compromised partner system. If one service is vulnerable to injection, insecure deserialization, or weak authentication, an attacker can use that foothold to call other services legitimately, using the compromised service's identity as a trusted actor. This creates cascading risk, where weaknesses propagate through the integration fabric, especially when trust relationships are broad and permissions are not narrowly scoped. Dependency security therefore includes assessing the security posture of services you integrate with, understanding their authorization model, and limiting what they can do in your system. In a distributed architecture, your security is only as strong as the weakest trusted caller that can reach your sensitive endpoints. When you tie all of these controls together, secure application programming interface integration comes down to identity, validation, and controlled exposure. Identity ensures you know who is calling and that the identity is meaningful, resistant to theft, and constrained by least privilege. Validation ensures that untrusted inputs cannot manipulate parsers or business logic, and that malformed or abusive requests fail safely without revealing internals. Controlled exposure ensures that automation cannot be abused at scale, that transport protections hold under hostile networks, and that logging provides the visibility needed to detect and respond. You do not get durable security by relying on one mechanism alone, because attackers exploit whichever boundary is weakest in the chain. When you build application programming interfaces with these principles as default design constraints, you make service integration both powerful and defensible in the face of real adversaries. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.